had always wanted to go on a solo camping trip. It's something I had thought about for years but never quite managed to get around to. There was always something holding me back. Work, family, or just the usual distractions of everyday life. But this time, I decided to stop making excuses and take the plunge. The mountains were calling me, and I was ready to answer. I had chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, far from the usual hiking trails and campsites. It was an area that didn't have much traffic, and that was exactly what I wanted. A few days away from everything, just me and the wilderness. I had spent the past few weeks planning the trip, researching everything I'd need, and making sure I was prepared for whatever the forest might throw at me. I woke up early the day of my departure, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was crisp and there was a chill to it, but I didn't mind. I was excited. I packed my bag, making sure to bring only the essentials. A tent, a sleeping bag, food for a few days, a map, and a compass. I also had a small knife, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone just in case. After a quick breakfast, I loaded everything into my car and set off. The drive to the trailhead was longer than I expected. The road started out paved, but as I got deeper into the mountains, it turned to dirt and then to gravel. The landscape around me was stunning, with tall trees lining the road and the occasional glimpse of a distant peak. There was something peaceful about the whole thing, like I was heading toward a place that was completely untouched by human hands. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was mid-morning. There were a few other cars parked in the lot, but I could tell they weren't going as far as I was. They were just there for a day hike or maybe a quick stroll through the forest. I grabbed my pack, double-checked that I had everything, and started down the trail. The hike started out easy enough. The path was wide and well-maintained, and the air smelled fresh, almost earthy. Birds chirped in the trees above, and the sound of a nearby stream provided a soothing background noise. For the first few miles, I didn't see anyone else. It was just me, the trail, and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals darted out of sight. The further I went, though, the trail began to narrow. It became less traveled, and the forest around me grew denser. The trees seemed taller, and the shadows darker. I could hear the wind howling high above, but the canopy of trees kept most of it from reaching the ground. The trail twisted and turned, winding its way deeper into the wilderness. Around midday, I stopped for a break. I found a nice spot near a small stream and sat down on a large rock. The water was cold and clear, trickling over smooth stones. I took out a snack, some trail mix, and a water bottle, and sat in silence, just listening to the sound of the water and the rustling leaves. For a moment, I felt completely at peace. This was what I had come for. The quiet, the solitude, and the connection with nature. After my break, I continued on, the trail getting steeper as I climbed higher into the mountains. The air was thinner here, and I found myself breathing harder. But I was determined to keep going. The peak wasn't too far now, and I was looking forward to the view from the top. Around mid-afternoon, the trail took a sharp turn, and I found myself standing at the edge of a steep drop-off. The wind was picking up, and I could feel the temperature starting to drop. I glanced down at the map, checking my progress. I was getting close to my campsite, just another mile or so. As I moved forward, though, I noticed something odd. The trail had become much less clear. There were no more markers, and the path seemed to fade in places. I stopped and checked my compass, making sure I was still headed in the right direction. According to the map, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though there was no one around. I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination. The mountain air was thinning, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But the feeling persisted, and with it came a sense of unease. I looked around, but all I saw were trees and rocks. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't long before the trail seemed to disappear altogether. There was no clear path ahead, just thick underbrush and uneven ground. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had probably gone off course. My heart began to race and I double-checked my map. According to my compass, I wasn't far from where I thought I should be, but everything around me looked unfamiliar. I decided to retrace my steps. I turned around and started heading back the way I came, keeping an eye on my surroundings. I knew it was getting late, and I didn't want to be out in the mountains after dark, but the forest seemed to have changed in those few minutes. The trees looked different, the shadows deeper. I felt a sense of panic creeping up on me, but I tried to stay calm. As the light began to fade, I knew I was in trouble. I had been hiking for hours now, and the trail was nowhere to be found. My phone had no signal and I didn't have a GPS. I was relying on the old-fashioned map and compass, but without the trail markers, I had no idea if I was going in the right direction. I made camp for the night, setting up my tent in a small clearing. The wind had picked up, and the temperature was dropping fast. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the growing sense of anxiety. I had made a mistake, but I didn't know how to fix it. The night was long and cold. I barely slept, waking up every few hours to listen to the wind rustling the trees. There was something eerie about the silence that settled over the forest. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation, that I was safe as long as I stayed in my tent. But my mind kept racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By morning, I knew I had to find my way out. The sun was up, but the forest was still shrouded in fog, making everything look even more unfamiliar. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, trying to stay calm. I needed to get back to the trailhead, but I had no idea which direction to go. I made a decision. I would follow the slope of the mountain, heading downhill in the hopes of finding the stream I had passed earlier. Water always led to civilization, or at least to some sort of landmark. I took a deep breath, steeled myself for the hike ahead, and started moving. The hike down was slow and difficult. The ground was uneven, and the dense underbrush made it hard to find a clear path. I slipped a few times, my boots catching on rocks and roots, but I kept going. Every step felt like a small victory, and as I descended further, the fog began to lift, and the forest started to look more familiar. It took hours, but finally, I heard the sound of water. I followed the sound, and soon I came to a small stream. It was the same one I had passed the day before, and I knew I was headed in the right direction. I followed the stream, keeping it on my left side, and after a few more miles, I came to a clearing. To my relief, I found the trail again. The familiar path wound its way through the trees, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had made it. I wasn't lost anymore. I followed the trail back to the trailhead, where I finally saw my car in the distance. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I was exhausted, covered in dirt, and hungry, but I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had made it through the wilderness alone. I hadn't given up. And most importantly, I had learned something about myself. I was stronger than I thought. As I drove home, the adrenaline slowly wore off, and I realized how close I had come to truly being lost. But the experience had taught me something invaluable. It wasn't about the hike itself, but about facing fear, trusting myself, and knowing when to ask for help. I had made it out safely, and that was enough. I smiled as I thought about the trip. It had been tough, but I was glad I had done it. The mountains had tested me, but they had also given me something to remember. A reminder that no matter how lost you feel, you can always find your way home. I set out on a hiking trip, determined to test my limits and enjoy the beauty of the wild. I had been planning this solo camping adventure for weeks. It wasn't the first time I'd hiked in the woods, but this time I was aiming for a more remote, less traveled trail that I had heard about from a few people. They described it as breathtaking, full of hidden views and peaceful solitude. Perfect, I thought. The morning I left, the sun was just starting to rise. There was a crisp chill in the air, the kind that makes you feel awake and alive, but not uncomfortable. My pack felt heavy, but it was manageable. I had all the essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, and enough layers to prepare for any weather changes. I also brought a small stove, some dry wood, and a tarp to set up a camp. I hadn't checked the weather forecast, but I trusted the trees and the sky. They'd tell me what I needed to know. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from the nearest town. When I finally reached it, the silence was almost overwhelming. I was surrounded by towering trees, their branches stretching high above. The road had been bumpy, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. As I grabbed my gear from the trunk and threw my pack over my shoulders, I looked around and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like the damp moss on the forest floor. I started my hike, following the narrow dirt trail that twisted and turned as it snaked its way through the woods. The ground was soft with patches of mud from the previous night's rain. The path was rugged, uneven in spots, and I could hear the rustling of leaves as small animals scurried nearby. Birds called from the trees, but their voices were distant, and the wind barely moved the air. I was alone, and I liked it that way. As I moved deeper into the forest, I felt the weight of the world slip away. Hiking had always been a way to clear my mind, and now, with each step, I felt more centered, more at peace. My legs burned with the effort, but it was a good kind of burn. It reminded me that I was doing something real, something that mattered. The trail wound its way up a series of gentle hills, and every now and then, I would pause to take in the view. The forest opened up here and there, revealing sweeping vistas of the valley below. The trees were dense, but the occasional break in the foliage allowed me to see far off into the distance. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. I felt lucky to be there, in that moment, breathing in the stillness. By midday, I reached a small stream that cut through the woods. The water was clear, bubbling over smooth stones as it wound its way through the landscape. I stopped for a break, taking out my water bottle and sipping the cool, refreshing liquid. The sound of the stream was soothing, and I decided to sit on a rock by the water for a while, letting my legs rest. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, which was exactly what I had hoped for. As the afternoon wore on, I continued my hike, steadily gaining elevation. The trail became steeper, and I had to slow my pace. The forest around me began to change. The trees thinned out a bit, and I noticed more shrubs and bushes growing along the path. The sunlight was starting to fade, and I realized that I would need to find a place to camp soon. I had planned to hike to a nearby ridge, but I wasn't sure how much farther I could push myself. Around 4 p.m., I found a suitable clearing. It wasn't much, just a small patch of flat ground surrounded by trees, but it would do. I was tired, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck hiking in the dark. I set up my tent quickly, pitching it on the flat spot. The forest around me seemed alive with sound. Crickets chirped in the underbrush, birds flitted between trees, and somewhere off in the distance, a deer crashed through the undergrowth. I made a small campfire and started preparing my dinner. I had brought along freeze-dried meals, which weren't exactly gourmet, but they did the job. As I sat by the fire, eating and watching the flames dance, I felt content. The warmth from the fire made the evening chill bearable, and the sounds of the forest provided a peaceful backdrop. I had no phone signal, no distractions, just the flickering light of the fire and the smell of the forest around me. As night fully settled in, the temperature dropped further. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the sounds of the night. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above me. It was a comforting sound. I was safe, I was warm, and I was alone in the way I wanted to be. But as I lay there in the dark, a thought kept gnawing at me. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't place it at first. It was subtle, just a feeling that something was off. I ignored it for a while, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd been hiking alone before. There was nothing out here that could harm me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't fear, at least I didn't think it was. It was more like a nagging sense that something was just wrong. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easily. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the bushes, seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. My mind raced with all sorts of thoughts, none of them helpful. Had I set up my camp properly? Was there any wildlife in the area that might be dangerous? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I managed to drift off into an uneasy sleep. It wasn't deep sleep, though. I kept waking up every so often, checking the time on my watch, listening for sounds outside the tent. At one point, I thought I heard something moving in the brush near my camp. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. It was probably a deer or some other animal, I told myself. I tried to relax. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and a tired mind. It was still early, just as the sun began to rise, but I felt the need to get up and moving. I packed up my camp, trying to shake off the odd feeling I had from the night before. There was no sign of anything unusual, no animal tracks, no signs of disturbance around my camp, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I decided to continue my hike, pushing on despite my lingering unease. I was determined not to let whatever it was get to me. The trail ahead was more challenging, winding through thick woods and over rocky terrain. My legs burned with the effort, but I kept pushing forward. The scenery was stunning. The rugged cliffs rising up on either side of me, the thick, lush trees growing around me. But even as I marveled at the beauty, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After several hours of hiking, I reached the ridge I had been aiming for. The view from the top was breathtaking, far more than I had anticipated. The valley stretched out before me, the forest below looking like a vast, undisturbed sea of green. The wind was strong up there, but it was refreshing. I stood there for a while, just taking it all in, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over me. The unease from the previous night had mostly faded, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. I knew I had a long descent ahead of me, but I didn't mind. The hardest part was over. I felt confident, like I had proven something to myself. I wasn't sure what had caused the unease the night before, but I was certain it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Nature had a way of doing that. As I made my way back down the trail, the path seemed less daunting. The sun was high in the sky now, warming the forest around me. The trail was still rugged, but it felt familiar now, like I belonged there. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, the sun was beginning to set once again. My legs were sore, but I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had done it. I had hiked through the woods alone, spent the night in the wilderness, and made it back in one piece. The car was still where I had left it, tucked away in the parking lot. I threw my pack into the trunk, wiped the sweat from my brow, and sat in the driver's seat. I wasn't sure what had made me feel uneasy, but now, looking back on it, I knew one thing for sure. There was nothing in those woods that could hurt me. I had faced the wild on my own, and I had come out stronger for it. As I drove back to town, the road winding through the forest, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The world seemed quieter, simpler, and though I couldn't explain the odd feeling I'd had during the night, I knew that the wilderness had a way of reminding you just how small and insignificant you really are. Yet, it also showed you how much strength you have when you face it head on. And in that, I found something beautiful. I had been looking forward to this hiking trip for weeks, maybe even months. The weather had been good, and the forecast promised clear skies and mild temperatures. The trail I'd picked was one I'd researched thoroughly. It was known for its beautiful views, but not overly crowded. I was tired of the busy, well-worn paths filled with groups of people talking too loudly, clogging up the best spots. I was after solitude, peace, and a chance to challenge myself. I packed my gear the night before, the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for the next few days. I was determined to keep it light, so I stuck to the basics. My backpack wasn't too heavy, but I could feel its weight on my shoulders as I stood in the early morning light, adjusting the straps. It wasn't long before I was walking down the road toward the trailhead. The morning air was crisp. The smell of pine trees and damp earth filled my lungs, grounding me. My boots crunched over gravel and dry leaves as I made my way to the start of the path. The trees stood tall around me, their leaves rustling gently in the wind. I was alone, felt good. The only sound was the rhythmic shuffle of my boots against the dirt. As I began to climb, the forest closed in around me. I had heard about the trail's difficulty, but the challenge didn't scare me. The first stretch wasn't too bad. A steady incline, but nothing I couldn't handle. The only real difficulty was the weight of my pack, but it was manageable. The trail wound up through the trees, each step taking me higher. I passed a few other hikers on the way up, but not many, just the way I liked it. As I hiked, I thought about the solitude. There was something calming about being in the woods, alone, surrounded by nature. It cleared my mind and made everything else seem less important. It was just me, the trail, and the quiet of the forest. The trail got steeper the higher I went. The trees became thicker, their branches intertwining above me, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I could hear birds singing in the distance and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached a small clearing. I paused for a water break and took in the view. From this spot, I could see the valley below, the small stream winding through it, and the distant mountains. It was beautiful, but I couldn't stay long. The trail was calling me. I packed up and continued on. The next section of the trail was a bit more challenging, with large rocks and roots sticking up out of the ground. My feet slipped a few times, but I caught myself each time. I took it slow, carefully placing each foot in front of the other. As I made my way higher, I noticed a slight change in the atmosphere. The air felt thinner, cooler. The trees were more sparse now, and the ground was rocky. I had reached the higher part of the trail. I felt the elevation in my legs, and my breathing became heavier, but I pushed through. The thought of reaching the top kept me going. A couple of hours passed, and the trail became less defined. I had to be more careful with my footing, as the rocks were loose, and I didn't want to twist an ankle. My legs were sore, and I could feel the exhaustion setting in, but I didn't stop. Finally, I reached the summit. The view was incredible. I stood there, panting, taking in the vast landscape. The mountains stretched out before me with jagged peaks and valleys. The air was cool and refreshing, and the sense of accomplishment filled me. I had made it. I found a spot near a large rock outcrop and set up camp. The tent went up easily enough, and I settled in for the night. As the sun began to set, the colors of the sky changed, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. I sat outside, eating a small meal, watching the stars begin to appear. It was peaceful, and the isolation felt like a luxury. I was miles from the nearest town, no distractions, no noise, just the crackling of my campfire and the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. I went to bed early, eager for the next day of hiking. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing outside my tent. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the air was still cool. I quickly packed up my camp, knowing I had a long day ahead. The The trail to the next section was supposed to be even more challenging, but I was ready for it. The hike down was surprisingly harder than the climb up. The rocks were loose and I had to be extra careful. My knees ached, and every step seemed to take more effort than it should. But I kept going. There were moments when I felt like I couldn't go any further, but I pushed through. By midday, I reached a small creek and stopped to rest. The cool water felt refreshing as I dipped my hands in. I took a long drink and sat for a while, listening to the sound of the creek and watching the small fish swim by. It was hard to believe how far I'd come. I knew the trail would be quieter now. The weekend crowd had thinned out, and I would be back to the solitude I craved. It was a long day of hiking, but I made it to my next campsite by evening. It wasn't as scenic as the last spot, but it was quiet, and I had it all to myself. That night, I sat by the fire, my body aching from the day's journey. I felt proud of myself, knowing that I was pushing my limits. But I was also reminded of the power of nature, how small I was in the grand scheme of things. I was just a person, walking through a vast world that had been here long before I arrived. It was humbling, but in a good way. I slept soundly that night, feeling content and accomplished. The next morning, I packed up once again and made my way back to the trailhead. My body was sore, but it was the kind of tired that felt earned, not the kind that leaves you drained. By the time I reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. I had hiked more than I thought I could, and I had done it alone. There's something about solo hiking that teaches you about yourself, about your limits, and about your resilience. As I drove away from the trailhead, I thought about how lucky I was to have experienced that trip. The peace of the mountains, the beauty of the forest, and the quiet of the trail. It was something I would carry with me. And as I drove back toward civilization, I realized that sometimes the best things in life come when we take the time to step away from it all. It was supposed to be an easy weekend trip, just a quick hike up the mountain and a night under the stars. I'd been hiking for years, so I figured I knew what to expect. A couple of days to disconnect, recharge, and enjoy nature. What I didn't expect was to end up in a situation where my survival instincts were the only things keeping me alive. I woke up early on Saturday, before the sun had even started rising. The air was crisp and cool, and the quiet of the morning was broken only by the sound of birds starting their daily chorus. I packed up my small tent, making sure to check that everything was in place: the stove, water bottle, a first aid kit, and, of course, my map and compass. I wasn't planning to go far, just a few hours of hiking to a secluded spot I had found on a hiking website. It seemed perfect, remote enough to feel alone, but not so far that I would risk getting lost. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car near the base of the mountain, made sure the doors were locked, and put my keys in a safe pocket of my backpack. The parking lot was almost empty, just a couple of cars that looked like they belonged to other hikers. The trailhead sign stood at the entrance of the path, its wooden posts weathered by years of exposure to the elements. I adjusted my backpack, took a deep breath, and set off. The beginning of the trail was easy to follow, well marked with clear signs and arrows. The path wound through a dense forest, with trees that towered above, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the early morning light. I could feel the dampness in the air, the coolness of the shadows, and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals scurried about. As I walked, I tried to focus on the sounds around me. The crunch of my boots on the dirt trail, the distant call of birds, the wind gently rustling through the branches. Everything was peaceful, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me. There was nothing but the trail ahead and the wild landscape surrounding me. After an hour or so, the trail began to ascend more steeply, and the ground became rougher. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and take a sip of water. The sun had risen higher by now, and I could feel its warmth breaking through the gaps in the trees. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and pressed on, knowing that I still had a long way to go. The higher I climbed, the more isolated the trail became. The dense forest started to thin out, and I found myself walking along a narrow ridge with steep drop-offs on either side. It wasn't dangerous, but it was unnerving. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and creak. I kept my eyes on the path, not wanting to risk losing my footing. At some point, the trail split into two. I checked my map and compass. The left path looked like it would lead me toward the camp spot I had planned to reach, so I took it. I could hear the sound of a creek below, the water rushing over rocks, and I knew that I was close. I had to be, but as I continued along the trail, something started to feel off. The trail wasn't as well marked as I thought it would be. I had passed a few markers that seemed out of place, the colors fading and the signs harder to spot. The further I went, the more I started to doubt myself. Had I missed something? Was this the right path? I tried to stay calm. It's easy to panic when you're alone in the wilderness, but I reminded myself that I was prepared. I had enough food, water, and gear to get me through a night if necessary. I checked my map again, but the trail was starting to look unfamiliar. I had followed the markings, but now everything felt wrong. I turned around and retraced my steps, hoping to find the point where I had gone off track. But no matter which direction I went in, the trail seemed to lead me deeper into the forest, further away from the marked paths. My heart started to race as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I needed to make a decision. I couldn't afford to wander aimlessly anymore. I stopped and sat on a large rock to think. My mind raced through all the options. I could try to find a way down the mountain, but I had no idea which direction was the right one. I could backtrack to the trailhead, but the sun was already starting to set, and I wasn't sure I could make it back before dark. I decided to camp for the night. It wasn't the ideal situation, but it was better than pushing myself further into unknown territory. I found a flat spot near a small stream and set up my tent. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I boiled some water for a simple meal and sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker as the darkness closed in around me. The night was quiet, except for the sounds of the creek and the occasional animal moving through the brush. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to relax, but my mind kept racing. I knew I had to make a decision in the morning, but for now I had to get some rest. The next day, I woke up early as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I felt a sense of urgency. Today, I had to find my way back. I packed up my gear, making sure to leave nothing behind, and set off again. This time, I made sure to stay focused on the trail, marking my path with small stones and sticks to avoid getting lost again. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The more I walked, the more I realized how easy it was to lose my bearings in the wilderness. The trees all looked the same, and the landscape had a way of disorienting me. I had relied too much on my map and compass, but now I wasn't sure which way I should go. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to feel the effects of my missteps. My legs were sore, and I was running low on water. I sat down by a large boulder and took a break, trying to think through my options. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in the distance. It wasn't an animal, but a man-made structure. A small cabin, barely visible through the trees. I knew I had to check it out. Maybe there was someone there who could help me. I made my way toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I realized the cabin was abandoned, its wood weathered and rotting. It was clear no one had lived there for years, but it still offered shelter. I ducked inside and found a small pile of wood next to the fireplace. I didn't waste any time starting a fire. That night, I stayed in the cabin, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I had made it through the night and I was still alive. The next morning, I woke up to find that the fog had cleared, and the sun was shining brightly. I stepped outside and surveyed my surroundings. I couldn't stay here forever, but I was closer to finding my way out. I followed the ridge, making my way down the mountain until I finally found the main trail again. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead. I was exhausted, thirsty, and hungry, but I was safe. The parking lot was still empty, and my car was just where I had left it. I tossed my backpack in the trunk and sank into the driver's seat, grateful to be heading home. As I drove back down the mountain, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. I had learned something important about myself. I had made mistakes, but I had stayed calm and kept my head together. The wilderness had tested me, but in the end, I had made it through. I'll never forget that trip. It wasn't the peaceful weekend getaway I had planned, but it was a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be. And sometimes, that's what makes it so beautiful. I had been planning this hike for months. The idea had grown on me over time, becoming an obsession almost. To get away from everything, to disappear into the forest, away from the constant buzz of city life. I needed this. The hike was supposed to be an escape, something to reset myself. It was a solo trip, just me, the woods, and the open trail. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, just as the first rays of sunlight were beginning to cut through the trees. The air was crisp, fresh, and smelled like earth, like rain-soaked soil and pine needles. The silence was deafening in a way, so still that I could hear the subtle rustle of leaves as the wind moved them. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, just a wide expanse of blue that stretched out over the treetops. I had packed everything I thought I would need: tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, a stove, food for several days, a water purifier, and a map. I double-checked everything before starting out, making sure the weight of the pack was balanced just right on my shoulders. I didn't want to be carrying too much, but I also didn't want to be caught without something crucial. There's a fine line between too much and too little when you're hiking alone, especially in unfamiliar terrain. The trail was narrow at first, winding through the underbrush. It was covered with fallen leaves, some still damp from the dew that hadn't yet evaporated. The trail sloped gently uphill, and as I walked, I focused on the rhythm of my footsteps, the sound of them crunching on the trail. It was calming. It made the weight of the pack on my back feel less noticeable. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the trees began to thin out. There were more rocks and shrubs now, the forest becoming more rugged. I took a moment to stop and admire the view. Below, the valley stretched out, a patchwork of farms and small houses nestled among the trees. It felt like I was on top of the world, the only person in the whole vast expanse of nature. I pushed on, finding a steady pace. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot. The temperature was cool enough that I didn't feel like I was sweating buckets, and the occasional breeze made it feel even more comfortable. It was peaceful out here, so far away from everything. No cars, no people, just the sounds of nature around me. Birds calling from the trees, the distant murmur of a stream, and the gentle rustling of leaves were the only sounds that filled the air. By midday, I reached a small clearing, a good spot to stop for a break. I set down my pack and took out some of the granola bars I had packed. It wasn't much, but I knew I had a long way to go, and I didn't want to overeat. I sat on a rock, looking around. The sunlight streamed through the branches above, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The peace was so complete, so absolute, that I could feel my mind unwinding. All the stress from my life, the noise and pressure, seemed to fade away. After a short rest, I packed up and started moving again. The trail became more difficult now, steeper and rockier. My legs burned with each step, but I pushed through it. This was part of the experience. The physical challenge was part of the reason I had come. It wasn't just about getting away. It was about testing myself, seeing what I could endure. It was late afternoon when I came across a stream. It was a small, babbling creek, but it looked like a good place to set up camp for the night. There was a flat area near the water, sheltered by a few large trees, and it seemed perfect for my tent. I unpacked, set up the tent, and filtered some water from the stream. The sun was setting now, the sky turning a soft orange and pink as the stars began to poke through the fading light. I sat by the fire I had built, watching the flames flicker and dance in the cool evening air. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that accompanied the rustling of the leaves in the trees. It was strange being this far out in nature, so far removed from anything familiar. But at the same time, it was incredibly peaceful. As the night grew darker, the temperature dropped, and I huddled closer to the fire, wrapping myself in a blanket. The stillness around me felt comforting, and I let the quiet wash over me. No one else was around. It was just me, the stars above, and the fire in front of me. The only thing that felt real was the warmth of the fire on my face and the steady sound of my breath. But as the hours passed, a feeling started creeping into the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. Couldn't shake it. The forest, which had been so still earlier, now seemed different. The sounds that had been comforting, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, started to feel eerie. I glanced over my shoulder at the darkened tree line, but all I could see were shadows. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave me. I tried to ignore it. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the woods, and when you're alone in the woods for long enough, your imagination starts to run wild. But it didn't help. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening more intently to the sounds around me. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in an unsettling way. It was colder now, the fire doing little to ward off the chill that was creeping into my bones. I knew I needed to sleep. I couldn't let this feeling of unease control me. So, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to get comfortable on my sleeping pad. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things, little noises just outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it started to sound like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to circle my camp. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. The sound stopped, but my heart was pounding in my chest. The forest had grown even quieter now, the normal rustling of leaves and the hum of insects gone. Only the distant murmur of the creek remained. I lay there, wide awake, my mind racing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest playing tricks on me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I finally drifted off to sleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my tent. The sun had risen, and everything felt normal again. The oddness of the previous night faded, replaced by the peace of the new day. I packed up my camp and continued on my hike, the trail now leading me through a dense thicket of trees. The sense of unease from last night was gone, replaced by the familiar rhythm of hiking. That night, I found another spot to camp, and this time I slept soundly. The rest of the trip passed without incident. The trail continued to wind through beautiful, serene landscapes, rocky ridges, dense forests, peaceful meadows. I took in the sights, the smells, the sounds. It was everything I had hoped for. On the final day of my hike, I reached the summit. From up there, I could see everything. The entire valley, the winding rivers, the distant mountains. Felt like I had conquered the world. It was an accomplishment I could be proud of, something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. As I made my way back down the mountain, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The unease from the first night was long gone, replaced by a deep contentment. I had faced the challenges of the wilderness, learned more about myself, and walked away stronger for it. I finally made it back to the trailhead where I had started, the spot where this whole journey had begun. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The city was still far away, but now, as I walked back to my car, I felt ready to rejoin it. I wasn't the same person who had started this journey. The hike had done what I needed it to do. It had reset me, and I was grateful for it. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for weeks. A week of solitude in the woods, just me and nature. I had been stuck in the city for far too long, and the constant noise was starting to wear me down. I needed space to think, breathe, and recharge. It was the first time I was going on a camping trip alone, and while the idea was exciting, I couldn't help but feel a little nervous. The plan was simple: hike a well-known trail, camp in a secluded spot, and spend a few days in the quiet of nature. I had my backpack packed with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, and extra layers in case the temperature dropped at night. It wasn't a long hike, but it was enough to get me away from civilization, which was all I wanted. The morning I left, the air was crisp and fresh. I could feel the anticipation building in my chest as I drove out of town. The highway slowly gave way to smaller roads, and soon I was on a dirt path leading deep into the forest. The trailhead came into view, and I parked my car, checking the map one last time. A quick glance at my watch told me it was just past 8 a.m., plenty of daylight ahead. The trail itself was narrow, winding through thick trees, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The first few steps felt like freedom. I could already hear the distant sounds of birds calling to each other, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, and the steady rhythm of my boots crunching the gravel beneath me. The hike was peaceful at first. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the trail. I'd heard about this particular trail being relatively easy, and it wasn't long before I found myself comfortably settled into the rhythm of the walk. There were moments when I could see clearings to the side, where wildflowers dotted the ground and streams babbled nearby. Everything felt perfect, untouched, like the forest was welcoming me home. As I continued, I passed a couple of campsites along the way, but they were all empty. I didn't mind. I wanted to find my own secluded spot, somewhere farther off the beaten path. My mind wandered, thinking about nothing in particular, just the pure quiet of the forest surrounding me. There was something about being out here that made everything feel simpler. I wasn't thinking about work or deadlines. I wasn't even thinking about what I had left behind. I was just here, with the earth beneath me and the sky above. The climb started to get steeper as I moved further along the trail. I knew the views from the higher points would be incredible, so I pushed forward. The incline made my heart beat faster, but it wasn't overwhelming. I paused to catch my breath a few times, drank some water, and kept going. By midday, I reached a plateau where I decided to take a break. I found a large rock overlooking a valley, its slopes covered in thick woods. Sitting down, I took in the scene before me. The valley stretched for miles, with mountain ridges rising in the distance, barely visible through the haze of the midday sun. The silence was perfect. No traffic, no voices, just the wind, the trees, and my thoughts. I ate a small snack, a trail mix I had packed, and took a moment to enjoy the stillness. It was moments like this that made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I pulled out my map again to check my location and realized I had made better time than I thought. The first part of the trail had been easier than expected, so I decided to push on a little further before finding a place to camp. The trail narrowed again, and the trees thickened as I ventured deeper into the forest. It wasn't long before I came to a small stream. The sound of running water was inviting, and I decided it would be the perfect place to set up camp. There was a small flat area just off the trail, and I could hear the water flowing gently nearby. The air here was cooler, and I noticed the scent of pine was stronger. I smiled, thinking this was exactly what I had been looking for. Setting up camp was always my favorite part of the trip. I worked quickly, laying out the tent and securing it with the stakes. I unrolled my sleeping bag and made sure everything was in order. As the day began to fade, the shadows in the woods grew longer, and I knew it wouldn't be long before darkness fell completely. I started a small fire near the stream, making sure to keep it contained and safe. As the flames crackled, I sat back, feeling the warmth on my face. The cool evening air brushed against my skin, but the fire kept the chill at bay. I ate a simple dinner, freeze-dried pasta, and listened to the sounds of the forest around me. The soft rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the constant murmur of the stream all combined into a soothing lullaby. Nightfall came quickly, and the sky above filled with stars. It was amazing how clear the sky was out here. Back in the city, the lights always obscured the stars, but out here, they seemed so close, as if I could reach out and touch them. I felt small in the best way possible, surrounded by the vastness of nature. There were no distractions here.
No noise, no rush.
Just me and the forest. I lay back in my sleeping bag, staring up at the sky. My eyes grew heavy, and I fell asleep under the canopy of stars. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. The air was cool, and there was still a slight mist in the valley. I got up and stoked the fire, adding a few more branches. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as I heated water for my breakfast. I sat by the fire, wrapped in my jacket, and watched as the world slowly woke up around me. It was a slow morning, but the peace of it was exactly what I needed. I knew I had a long hike ahead, but for now I was content just being here. No schedule, no rush. The whole world could wait. I had been planning the trip for weeks, the kind of trip that promised to reset my mind and get me out of the noise of the city. The mountains had always been a place of calm for me, and I was ready to immerse myself in the quiet, to breathe in the fresh, crisp air, and to disconnect from everything. No phone, no distractions, just the sounds of the wind and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I woke up at 5 a.m., just as the first light was creeping across the sky. I packed my backpack the night before, so there was little to do except double-check everything and get moving. I had everything I thought I would need: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for a couple of days, first aid kit, flashlight, extra socks, and a sturdy pair of boots. The map was already tucked into the top of my bag, and I knew the trail like the back of my hand. I had hiked it before, but this time I was going solo. The drive to the trailhead was quiet. The roads were empty, the kind of emptiness that made the early morning feel like a secret. The sky was still mostly dark, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting through the hills, past thick forests and quiet streams. I pulled into the small parking lot just as the sun began to rise, the world still draped in early morning fog. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I could already hear the distant rush of water in the creek. I grabbed my pack from the back seat, adjusted the straps, and took a deep breath. There was something about being out here, away from the rush of the world, that felt like coming home. The trail started off easy enough, winding through tall trees, their trunks thick and dark in the early morning light. The ground was soft underfoot, a mix of pine needles and moist earth, and the air was still cool from the night. I moved steadily, keeping my pace slow and steady. There was no need to rush. I was here to enjoy the journey, not to finish it in a hurry. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for wildlife. I wasn't expecting to see much. This trail was known for being quiet, even on the busiest days, but I always liked to watch for signs of life. A deer, maybe, or a squirrel darting through the underbrush. There were tracks here and there, fresh prints in the mud where animals had passed through, but nothing moving in front of me just yet. The further I went, the more the trail narrowed, twisting and turning between trees. The air felt thicker, more saturated with the smells of the forest, and the ground became rockier. I had hiked this trail before, but today it felt different. The silence seemed more pronounced, the rustling of the wind through the leaves louder somehow, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing in time with my steps. About 2 hours in, I came to the first real challenge of the hike, a steep incline that led up to a ridge. The path was jagged, with loose rocks that threatened to slip underfoot if I wasn't careful. I paused for a moment, taking a sip of water and surveying the climb. It wasn't anything I couldn't handle, but it would take some effort. I started up the ridge slowly, each step deliberate. The air was thinner here, and I could feel my heart rate pick up as I pushed myself. The view behind me opened up as I climbed, and I could see the valley stretching out below, the trees rolling over the hills like waves on the ocean. It was breathtaking, and for a moment, I paused, allowing myself to just take it in. When I reached the top, I was greeted with a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. The sun had fully risen by now, casting long shadows over the ridges and valleys below. I stood there for a moment, soaking in the quiet, feeling the wind against my skin. There was something humbling about being so small in such a vast landscape. The descent from the ridge was just as challenging. The trail was steep and loose, and I had to be careful with each step to avoid slipping. My boots gripped the rocks well, but I still had to move cautiously. I concentrated on each step, pushing the thought of the long day ahead out of my mind. As I descended, the forest around me seemed to grow denser. The trees were closer together now, their branches thick with moss, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The ground was wetter, and I had to be mindful of the mud that had started to accumulate on the trail. It was slower going here, but I didn't mind. The trail had become more remote, and I was starting to feel a sense of peace wash over me, the kind that only comes from being completely alone in nature. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a creek, the perfect spot to set up camp. The water was crystal clear, tumbling over smooth rocks, and I could hear the sound of it rushing by as I took off my pack. I surveyed the area, making sure there were no signs of recent visitors. The site seemed untouched, the grass still green, the fire ring rusted but functional. I set up my tent quickly, finding a flat spot near the creek where the ground was dry. It was quiet here, the only sounds coming from the babbling water and the occasional bird call. I unpacked my gear, setting up the stove and preparing to make some food. There was something comforting about this simple routine, the rhythm of setting up camp and getting ready for the evening. It was a rhythm that felt natural, something I had done countless times before. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the camp. The temperature dropped quickly, and I bundled up in my warm jacket. The fire crackled to life, and I sat beside it, watching the flames dance as I ate. I could hear the sounds of the forest around me, the wind rustling the trees, the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest, while beautiful, had always felt a little intimidating in its vastness. As night fell, I retreated to my tent. I lay on my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind had picked up, and I could hear the trees groaning as they swayed. It was the kind of night where the silence was so deep that you could hear every little sound. Every crackling branch, every rustle in the leaves, seemed amplified in the darkness. I tried to push the unease out of my mind and closed my eyes, hoping for sleep, but the night dragged on, the sounds of the forest becoming more pronounced, more unsettling. The wind howled outside, and the tent flapped against the gusts. It was the kind of night that made you question your decision to come out here alone. I eventually drifted off, but it wasn't a deep sleep. I woke up several times during the night, the wind howling louder each time. By the time morning came, I was exhausted but relieved to see the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. The storm had passed, and the air felt clearer, fresher. I packed up camp slowly, taking my time to break down the tent and gather my gear. There was no rush. I had planned to stay another night, but the storm had changed my mind. I decided it was time to head back to the trailhead. The hike back was easier, the trail familiar under my feet. The sky was clear now, and the air was fresh and crisp. I passed the ridge again, this time enjoying the view even more, knowing that I had made it through the storm. By the time I reached the trailhead, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The car was where I left it, parked in the same quiet lot, and as I drove back down the mountain, I realized just how much I needed this trip. It wasn't about the hike or the camping or even the solitude. It was about reconnecting with the world, with myself, in a way that nothing else could provide. I knew I would return again, maybe sooner than I thought. I had been looking forward to this hiking trip for months, the kind of escape where everything is left behind, where I could immerse myself in nature without distractions. The plan was simple. Spend a few days hiking up a remote trail, camp along the way, and finally reach a secluded mountain lake that promised some quiet solitude. No phone, no people, just me, the woods, and the stars. I packed my bag carefully the night before, making sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, and a map of the area. I even double-checked the weather forecast, which promised mild temperatures and clear skies. I was prepared for everything, or so I thought. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from where I was staying. It was located in a less traveled part of the national park, which was exactly what I wanted. There were no crowds, no rangers, just wide, untouched wilderness. As I drove closer, the excitement in me built up. This was it, my getaway. I parked at the small lot near the trailhead, grabbed my pack, and began my hike. The first few miles were relatively easy, just a steady incline through dense forest. The smell of pine was thick in the air, the ground soft with pine needles. I breathed it in deeply, feeling the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The trail started to get steeper as I climbed higher into the mountains. The trees thinned out, giving way to rocky terrain and patches of open grass. The view behind me started to open up, and I could see the valley I had just crossed, dotted with small streams and wildflowers. It was peaceful, serene, a perfect escape. After a few more hours, I stopped to rest. I found a small clearing by a stream where I could sit and have a snack. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light through the trees. I knew I needed to keep moving if I wanted to set up camp before dark, so I only stayed for a quick break. As the daylight began to fade, the atmosphere shifted. The forest became quieter, and the path seemed less clear. I had expected some challenges along the way, but the trail was starting to feel more rugged, more wild. I checked my map. It showed I was still on the right track, but it didn't prepare me for what I was about to encounter. As I hiked further, the trail began to disappear entirely. What had been a clear path now became a series of faint markers that were barely visible. I could feel the discomfort creeping in as I realized how far I had strayed from what I had imagined. I wasn't lost, but I was starting to wonder if I had made a wrong turn somewhere. I stopped for a moment to reassess. I pulled out my map again, trying to get a better sense of where I was. There were no landmarks nearby, and the fading light made it difficult to see anything clearly. The trees closed in around me, and the trail seemed to fade into the wilderness. I made the decision to keep going. I wasn't about to turn back. I come this far and the lake wasn't far now. I trusted my instincts, my preparation. With a deep breath, I forged ahead, following the faintest of trail markers. The next hour was a mix of uncertainty and quiet determination. The sounds of the forest were all around me now. Wind in the trees, the occasional call of a bird, and the rustle of leaves beneath my boots. By the time I reached the edge of a large ridge, the sky had darkened completely, and the stars had begun to appear. I could see the faint outline of a peak in the distance, but nothing looked familiar. I looked at my map again, trying to match the terrain with the landmarks, but nothing added up. I was frustrated, but I refused to give up. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, scanning the surrounding area for a better sign of the trail. After another half hour of scrambling over rocky terrain, I found a small flat area where I could set up camp. I had no idea if I was on the right track, but I needed to rest. The exhaustion from the day's hike was catching up with me, and the air had become colder. It would be a long night, I realized, but at least I had a place to sleep. Setting up my tent felt like a small victory. I crawled inside, unrolled my sleeping bag, and wrapped myself in its warmth. The night outside was still, quiet except for the occasional creak of the trees. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to reassure myself that I wasn't too far off course. But the doubt lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. The next morning, I woke up early. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake somewhere along the trail. I ate a quick breakfast of granola bars and packed up my things. The cold air bit at my skin as I started to hike again, trying to retrace my steps from the day before. The light was dim, the fog still clinging to the trees, but the path was a little clearer now. I followed the ridge for what felt like hours, checking my map and my surroundings constantly. The more I walked, the more I realized I had been heading in the wrong direction. The lake I was aiming for was still miles away, and I had veered off course entirely. My frustration began to grow. I didn't want to admit it, but I was lost. Worse, I was running out of daylight. I knew I needed to make a decision. The trail ahead was unclear, and I had no idea how to get back on track. So, I decided to do what I had been trained to do in situations like this. I stayed put and waited. The best thing to do when lost is not to panic. I sat down, took deep breaths, and thought about my options. By the time the sun was high in the sky, I was starting to feel calmer. I pulled out my compass and map, analyzing the terrain around me. I knew the mountain lake was to the north, so I decided to head in that direction. I made a plan to walk for a couple of hours and then reassess. The last thing I wanted to do was keep walking aimlessly, so I gave myself clear goals. After a couple of hours, the forest began to change again. The trees opened up, and I could see more of the mountain ahead. There was a familiar sign, a large outcrop of rocks I remembered from the map. I had found my bearings again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto the trail that led to the lake. My relief was immense. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't lost anymore. The hike had taken longer than expected, but I had made it. The lake was just ahead, nestled in a valley surrounded by tall peaks. The air was crisp and fresh, and the stillness of the place was more perfect than I had imagined. I set up camp by the lake that afternoon. The sun was beginning to set again, casting a soft, golden light over the water. I made a warm meal, sitting by the edge of the lake, reflecting on everything. The journey had been challenging, but it had taught me something important about patience and perseverance. The next morning, I woke up early and sat by the lake, watching the first light of day spill across the water. The whole world felt peaceful again, and I realized how grateful I was for the experience. Hiking alone, getting lost, and finding my way back had been a reminder of how resilient I could be. I had faced my fear and I had made it through. The days that followed were a quiet celebration of solitude. I spent my time fishing, exploring the area, and simply enjoying the beauty around me. The trip wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And when it was time to head back down the mountain, I felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that I had learned something about myself along the way. The hike back was smooth and easy. The trail was clear, and the weather was perfect. I was ready to return to the world, but I would always carry the lessons of the mountains with me. The feeling of peace, the sense of challenge, and the reminder that even when things go wrong, it's possible to find your way again. And as I made my way back to the trailhead, I couldn't help but smile. It had been an adventure, a hard, real adventure, and it had been worth every moment. I had always loved the idea of getting away from it all, to find some peace and quiet in the wilderness. The noise, the people, the rush of everyday life, it all felt like too much at times. So when I found a secluded hiking trail online that promised a weekend camping adventure far off the beaten path, I jumped at the chance. This was going to be a chance to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. The trail was supposed to be remote, tucked away deep in the forest, with a stunning mountain view at the top. Perfect, I thought. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and extra layers of clothing for the cold nights in the mountains. The essentials all packed tightly into my backpack. I set out early the next morning, excited for what lay ahead. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The roads slowly grew quieter as I neared the mountain range, the familiar hum of civilization fading away. When I arrived, the trailhead sign greeted me with nothing more than a worn wooden post and an old map that seemed like it hadn't been updated in years. I checked my gear one last time before setting off. The first part of the trail was a gentle climb, winding through thick trees and overgrown brush. The air was cool, and I could hear the sounds of birds chirping high up in the canopy, a soft breeze rustling the leaves. The scent of pine filled the air, and with each step, I felt like the weight of the world was lifting off my shoulders. I had no set time to reach the summit, so I took my time, enjoying the solitude. As the trail ascended, the terrain became steeper, and the trees thinned out. The trail was less defined here, overgrown with brambles and rocks scattered along the path. I had to carefully watch my footing, making sure I didn't slip on the loose gravel. But despite the challenges, I pressed on, determined to reach the top. The higher I climbed, the more I could see the vastness of the landscape unfolding around me. Rolling hills, rugged cliffs, and distant peaks covered in snow. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. There was a stream nearby, its water sparkling under the sun as it babbled over rocks. It looked like the perfect spot to rest. I found a flat area to pitch my tent, careful not to disturb any wildlife that might be nearby. The process of setting up my camp was meditative, each motion familiar as I hammered in stakes and unfurled the tent. The scent of fresh soil and the sound of the wind through the trees felt grounding. After I finished setting up, I collected firewood and started a small fire. It wasn't large, just enough to warm myself and cook a meal. I had packed some freeze-dried camping food, so all I had to do was add boiling water. As the food rehydrated, I sat back on a rock and watched the flames dance. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The quiet was almost deafening in its intensity, a silence I had not experienced in a long time. No cars, no voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and curled up in my sleeping bag. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, branches creaking, animals moving in the distance. It was a peaceful kind of loneliness, a feeling I hadn't realized I missed. I drifted off to sleep with the comforting rhythm of nature surrounding me. The next morning, I woke up early, the light of dawn filtering through the trees. The air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I stepped outside. I made a quick breakfast of granola and coffee, packed up my campsite, and continued up the trail. The terrain was getting rougher now, more rocky and uneven. The steepness of the climb was taking a toll on me, but I kept going, determined to see the view from the top. By noon, I had reached the summit. The view was everything I had hoped for and more. The mountains stretched out before me, towering peaks covered in snow, valleys below dotted with lakes, and forests as far as the eye could see. I stood there for a long while, just taking it all in. The effort to get here, the sweat and the aching muscles, felt worth it in that moment. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, I had been in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. This was a reminder of how vast the world really was. After taking in the view, I decided to head back down. I was tired, my legs sore from the climb, but I was content. I retraced my steps, taking my time as I descended. The way down was just as challenging as the way up, with loose rocks and steep sections. But the knowledge that I had reached the top kept me going. I was almost back to my campsite when I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but the sound was different, heavier, closer. I froze, listening intently. The rustling grew louder, and then, to my surprise, I saw something move through the underbrush. A bear. It wasn't far from me, just a few yards away, and it looked like it was heading in the same direction. My heart began to race. I'd read about encounters with bears, but it was something entirely different to face one in person. I slowly backed away, careful not to make any sudden movements. The last thing I wanted was to startle it. The bear didn't seem to notice me at first, but then, as it sniffed the air, it turned and looked straight at me. For a moment, we locked eyes, and time seemed to slow. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my legs frozen in place. But I didn't panic. I remembered the advice I'd read online. Stay calm, don't run, and make yourself look bigger. So, I slowly raised my arms, trying to seem larger. The bear stared at me for a few moments longer, and then, to my relief, it turned and lumbered off into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there for a long time, catching my breath and trying to steady my nerves. That encounter had shaken me, but I knew it was just part of being out here in the wild. I had been prepared for it in some ways, but the reality was different. I was grateful the bear had decided to move on without any confrontation. After a while, I resumed my descent, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was beginning to set again. I was exhausted but felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced the challenges of the trail, the physical strain, and even a bear encounter, but I had made it. I set up camp one last time, this time with a deeper sense of gratitude for the wilderness. It was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also beautiful and peaceful in a way that nothing else could be. That night, as I lay in my tent, I reflected on the past few days. The hike had been tough. The solitude had been both comforting and unsettling at times, and the encounter with the bear had been a stark reminder of the unpredictability of nature. But through it all, I had learned something important: how to be present, how to appreciate the simple things, and how to survive when things didn't go as planned. The next morning, I packed up my camp one last time and headed back down the trail. The hike down was much easier now that I was heading home, and by the time I reached my car, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I had made it through the wilderness, faced some challenges, and come out stronger for it. And as I drove away from the trailhead, I knew I would always carry a piece of that adventure with me. The wilderness had a way of putting everything into perspective. Out there, away from all the distractions of everyday life, I had found something that I had been missing for a long time, a sense of peace. I promised myself that I would come back one day, ready for whatever the trail would throw at me next. But for now, I was just happy to be heading home, knowing that I had experienced something real and raw in the heart of nature. I had always been drawn to the outdoors. There was something about the simplicity of nature that calmed me, a stark contrast to the busy noise of city life, the hum of traffic, the constant rush of work, the endless cycle of routine. All of it faded away the moment I set foot on a trail. That's why I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the wilderness. Just me, my gear, and the mountains. The plan was simple: a 2-day hike to a remote campsite deep in the woods, where I could truly disconnect. I had done my research, mapped out my route, and packed everything I thought I'd need. A lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a portable stove, food, water, and all the small necessities. Flashlight, first aid kit, extra socks, and a good pair of hiking boots. I was excited and nervous at the same time. Hiking alone had always been something I dreamed about, but I knew it came with its own set of challenges. Still, I was prepared. The trailhead was easy enough to find, nestled between 2 tall pines at the edge of a dense forest. It was early morning, the air crisp with the cool bite of dawn. I adjusted the straps of my backpack, gave a last glance to the signpost that marked the beginning of the trail, and then started walking. The path wound through the trees, the ground soft beneath my boots, occasionally giving way to roots and small rocks that made me slow my pace. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of my decision. This wasn't a simple walk through a park. This was a real hike, a journey into the wild. The first few hours went by relatively smoothly. The landscape around me shifted, becoming wilder as I moved further from civilization. The trees grew taller, their branches tangled high above, blocking out much of the sun. The ground became uneven, and the scent of earth and pine filled my nose. The sounds of the forest were all around me. The rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the distant sound of water trickling somewhere far off. I felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing I was where I belonged. I took a break around noon, finding a flat spot beside a small stream. I pulled out my water bottle and had a drink, the cold water refreshing my dry throat. As I sat there, I looked at my map again, confirming my route. The first leg of the hike was relatively easy, but the next part would be more challenging. I would be heading into a section of the trail known for its steeper climbs, but I was ready for it. I finished my snack, repacked my gear, and set off once again. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier. The path grew steeper, and I found myself stopping more often to catch my breath. My legs were burning, but I pressed on. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. I hadn't expected to reach the campsite until later that evening, so I wasn't too worried. I was in no rush. The journey itself was the reward. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. I stopped for a moment to take it all in. From this vantage point, I could see for miles. The rolling hills, the distant mountains, and the wide expanse of the wilderness stretching out before me. It was a breathtaking sight, one that made the hard climb worth every step. The campsite was just a short way down the trail, nestled in a small clearing by a lake. I found it easily enough, the last remnants of sunlight fading as I arrived. The lake was calm, the surface reflecting the colors of the sky. There was no one else around, just the quiet solitude of nature. I set up my tent quickly, the muscles in my legs sore but still functional. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional splash from the lake were the only noises that filled the air. I felt a deep sense of contentment, Dinner was simple, freeze-dried meals, which I had come to appreciate for their convenience. I boiled some water on my portable stove, mixed in the food, and ate as I watched the night settle in. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, the chill of the evening air creeping in. I bundled up in my warm layers and climbed into my sleeping bag. As I lay there in the quiet, staring at the ceiling of my tent, I felt a sense of peace that was hard to explain. I was alone, but in the best possible way. There was no one else here to distract me, to demand anything from me. Just the forest, the lake, and me.